September 1944. A British farmer's audacious deception saved 50 stranded paratroopers behind enemy lines using nothing but hay, rope, and nerve. For 21 days, Nazi patrols walked within meters of what they believed was ordinary farm storage, whilst an entire platoon survived beneath. The secret, a ventilation system so ingenious that German engineers later studied it in disbelief. What began as desperate improvisation became tactical doctrine that British Special Operations Executive classified until 1987. The rain hammered down on the fields outside Arnhem at 03:47 on 19th September 1944. Cold enough to see your breath, loud enough to mask the groans of injured men dragging themselves through mud. Sergeant William Davies crouched behind a drainage ditch, counting heads by moonlight filtered through storm clouds. 47 paratroopers remained from his original company of 63. Operation Market Garden had spectacularly failed to achieve its corridor objectives, and now they were 15 kilometers behind German defensive positions with no wireless, no resupply, and enemy mechanized patrols systematically sweeping every farmhouse, barn, and hedgerow. The strategic mathematics was brutally simple. British XXX Corps had failed to reach the Arnhem Bridge within the planned 48 hours. The drop zones were now completely controlled by SS Panzer divisions that intelligence had categorically assured command were not present in the area. Those assurances had been catastrophically wrong. Waffen-SS reconnaissance battalions were conducting systematic grid searches using tracker dogs, infrared detection equipment, and local collaborators who knew every cellar, every hidden room, every traditional hiding place that resistance networks had used since 1940. The standard evasion protocol, disperse into small groups, move only at night, make for Allied lines, was impossible because German forces had established defensive positions in depth. Every road was checkpointed, every bridge was guarded, every farm was being searched daily. Davies was 34 years old, from Stoke-on-Trent, a mathematics teacher before conscription who'd proven himself methodical under pressure during training at Ringway. His platoon trusted him because he never promised certainties he couldn't deliver. Now he faced a problem with no precedent in the field manual. 47 men, 12 seriously wounded who couldn't walk more than a kilometer. In hostile territory where every local was potentially reporting to occupation authorities, with enemy forces conducting sweep operations every 6 hours. Traditional escape routes through church crypts and farm cellars were compromised because collaborators were providing Wehrmacht intelligence with detailed architectural plans. Attempting to move during darkness was suicide because German patrols were using illumination flares at irregular intervals, and the wounded couldn't maintain pace. Private Thomas Ashford, 19 years old from Liverpool Docks, had a sucking chest wound packed with field dressings that needed changing every 4 hours. Corporal James Fletcher, from Yorkshire coal country, had compound fractures in his left leg, held together with splints fashioned from rifle stocks. Lance Corporal Robert Hughes from Cardiff Docks had shrapnel wounds across his back that were becoming infected despite sulphur powder. They couldn't walk. They couldn't be carried for long distances. They needed shelter where German search teams wouldn't discover them. But every traditional hiding place was being systematically eliminated. The skepticism from within Davies's own command structure was immediate when he suggested holding position rather than attempting to break through. Lieutenant Morrison, the surviving officer, argued that staying in one location violated every principle of evasion training. Regulations specified dispersal and movement. Staying concentrated was inviting disaster. But Davies had observed something during 3 days of evading German patrols. Wehrmacht soldiers conducted searches with thoroughness, but also with pattern. They searched buildings meticulously, examining cellars and attics with infrared lamps and detection equipment. They interrogated occupants about strangers, but they treated agricultural areas as low-priority targets. They walked past hay ricks, grain storage and field equipment with minimal inspection, because their operational doctrine assumed escaped personnel would seek indoor shelter where food, water and protection from weather were available. At 04:15, sheltering in a copse of trees whilst German half-tracks rumbled past on the nearby road, Davies made his proposal to Morrison. They needed to find somewhere that Wehrmacht search doctrine would dismiss as tactically impossible. Somewhere that German efficiency would classify as searched, without actual thorough inspection. Somewhere that violated every assumption about where soldiers would hide. Morrison was desperate enough to listen. They had perhaps 12 hours before the wounded became immobile from infection and exposure. After that, they'd have no choice except surrender. At 06:30, as dawn broke grey and cold over the Dutch countryside, Private Kenneth Wright spotted a farmhouse isolated from the nearest village by nearly 2 kilometers of open fields. The building showed signs of partial abandonment, several windows broken, one outbuilding burned, no livestock visible. But behind the main house stood 3 massive hayricks, each perhaps 10 meters at the base, 7 meters high, constructed in the traditional Dutch method of stacking around central timber frames. The location was exposed, visible from the road, exactly the kind of place where no sensible evading soldier would hide, which was precisely why Davies thought it might work. The farmhouse itself was occupied by a single elderly resident, a farmer named Hendrik van Olst, who'd lost his sons to labor conscription in 1943. When Davies and Morrison approached at 07 leisure, explaining their situation with the few words of Dutch they'd learned from phrase cards, Van Olst's response was immediate and practical. Yes, German patrols searched his property every second day. Yes, they always inspected the farmhouse thoroughly. No, they never properly searched the hayricks, because their operational assumption was that no soldier could survive inside one for longer than a few hours without suffocating. And besides, Wehrmacht doctrine considered agricultural storage too exposed for effective concealment. They walked past the ricks, occasionally stabbed bayonets into them randomly, but never conducted systematic searches. Davies understood immediately that this created an opportunity based entirely on German assumptions about what was tactically possible. If they could construct concealment inside the hayrick that included ventilation, structural support, and camouflage sufficient to pass cursory inspection, they could hide in plain sight within 50 meters of German patrols. It violated every conventional wisdom about evasion. It was desperate. It was probably mad. But the alternative was certain capture, or attempting an impossible breakthrough with wounded men who couldn't walk. At 08:30, with German motorcycle patrols visible in the distance, Davies made the decision that would define the next 3 weeks. They would rebuild one of the hayricks with a concealed chamber at its center, large enough for 47 men. They would engineer ventilation that wouldn't be visible from outside. They would construct it during daylight hours, whilst German forces were conducting searches elsewhere, gambling that Wehrmacht efficiency would work in their favor. Once a property was searched in the morning cycle, it typically wasn't revisited until evening. Van Olst would maintain his normal routine, cooperating with German demands, showing them through his house, answering questions, acting precisely as a frightened farmer under occupation would act. And beneath tons of hay, an entire platoon would wait for Allied forces to reach them, or die trying to outlast the systematic German search operation that was slowly eliminating every other hiding place in the region. The construction began at 09:15 on 19th of September, with 8 hours available before the evening patrol cycle resumed. The physical environment was brutally unforgiving. The hay Rick Van Olst, designated for modification, was 7 meters high and contained approximately 40 tons of dried grass pressed into bales over timber framing. The central timber posts, each 30 centimeters in diameter, formed a skeleton that supported the entire structure. Davies's immediate challenge was engineering a hollow chamber at the ground level without compromising structural integrity enough to make the rick visibly collapse or sag, which would immediately alert German inspection teams. The technological limitations were severe. They possessed entrenching tools, bayonets, parachute cord, field knives, and nothing else remotely resembling construction equipment. Van Alst provided a handsaw, hammer nails salvaged from his burned-out building, and canvas tarpaulins used for weather protection. That was the entire tool inventory. From these materials, they needed to construct a chamber measuring roughly 4 meters by 3 meters by 2 meters high, barely sufficient for 47 men sitting shoulder to shoulder, with ventilation adequate to prevent carbon dioxide suffocation. Davies assigned tasks with ruthless efficiency, born from understanding they had no margin for error. 8 men under Corporal Fletcher began carefully removing hay bales from ground level, stacking them temporarily against the adjacent rick. 12 men under Private Ashford began excavating a shallow depression in the earth beneath, going down 60 centimeters to create additional headroom. The removed soil was scattered across Van Alst's fields, mixed with manure so it wouldn't form visible piles. 10 men began constructing interior bracing from timber salvaged from the burned-out building, creating a frame that would support the hay mass above once the chamber was hollowed out. The ventilation system represented the most critical challenge. Human beings exhale carbon dioxide at a rate requiring approximately 8 cubic meters of fresh air per person per hour to prevent dangerous accumulation. 47 men would require roughly 370 cubic meters hourly, creating airflow through a chamber buried beneath tons of hay without visible external vents that would alert German inspectors, required genuine innovation under impossible time pressure. Private Edmund Price, a mining engineer from Durham coalfields before conscription, proposed the solution that made survival possible. Instead of direct ventilation shafts that would create visible holes, they would construct a distributed airflow network using hollow bamboo poles that Van Alst used for garden stakes. These poles, each 3 centimeters in diameter, would be inserted at angles through the hay mass, creating airways that appeared from outside to be natural gaps between bales. By positioning 24 poles at varying angles, they could create passive ventilation that drew fresh air from multiple points around the rick's perimeter and exhausted stale air through different pathways. The system relied entirely on convection, warm, exhaled air rising naturally while cool, fresh air was drawn in from ground level. The environmental challenges multiplied as work progressed. The weather remained cold, between 8 and 11 degrees Celsius, with intermittent rain that made the hay slippery and the excavated earth muddy. Men worked in shifts, some digging, some hauling, some standing watch for approaching patrols, rotating every 30 minutes, because the physical exertion in near-freezing temperatures caused dangerous heat loss when they stopped moving. The wounded lay in the copse under parachute silk, guarded by 3 men who would signal if German forces approached unexpectedly. The human cost manifested immediately. Private Ashford's chest wound reopened from exertion at 11:30, requiring emergency repacking with increasingly scarce field dressings. Corporal Fletcher's fractured leg couldn't bear weight, so he directed his team while sitting propped against hay bales, face grey with pain. Lance Corporal Hughes developed fever from infection, shivering uncontrollably despite being wrapped in 3 greatcoats. But they continued working because stopping meant certain capture. The organizational challenges created constant friction. Van Alst received a visit from the local NSB collaborator, a Dutch fascist who served as German liaison at 13 requiring all 47 paratroopers to freeze absolutely silent in the partially completed chamber while the collaborator walked within 10 meters of their position, discussing grain requisition quotas with Van Alst. The Dutch farmer maintained perfect composure, complaining bitterly about Wehrmacht seizures, while standing directly above men who would be executed if discovered. The collaborator departed after 20 minutes that felt like hours. At 14:30, a German motorcycle patrol stopped at the farm, conducting their scheduled search. Van Alst invited them into the farmhouse with convincing nervousness, offering ersatz coffee, whilst Wehrmacht soldiers examined his cellar and attic. The paratroopers remained frozen in the incomplete chamber, barely breathing, listening to German voices discussing the search operation's progress. One soldier walked to the hayrick, stabbed his bayonet randomly into it 3 times, and walked away satisfied. The blade passed within a meter of Private Wright's position. The patrol departed at 15. By 16:30, the chamber was structurally complete, braced with timber, floored with canvas tarpaulins over earth, with ventilation poles positioned throughout the haymass. The most dangerous phase remained, transferring all 47 men into the chamber and rebuilding the hay wall that would seal them inside. This required absolute precision, because once the entrance was closed, there could be no modifications. If the ventilation failed, if the structure collapsed, if German inspectors became suspicious, they would be trapped. At 17 Nas, as autumn darkness approached and the evening patrol cycle began, the last man entered the chamber. Van Alst and 4 paratroopers rebuilt the entrance using hay bales carefully positioned to create a concealed access point that could be opened from inside. By 17:45, from external appearance, the hayrick looked entirely normal, slightly weathered, one section perhaps a bit more compressed than others, but nothing that would trigger suspicion from soldiers conducting routine inspections. Inside, 47 British paratroopers sat in absolute darkness, breathing carefully, listening to their own heartbeats, feeling the temperature drop as night arrived. The ventilation system was working. They could feel cool air moving across their faces, but the psychological impact of being buried alive beneath tons of hay was immediate and crushing. Some men began breathing rapidly, fighting claustrophobia. Davies's voice, calm and steady, reminded them they'd survived the first day. They just needed to survive the next 20. The first German search of the modified hay rick occurred at 08:30 on 20th of September, 18 hours after the paratroopers had sealed themselves inside. Wehrmacht soldiers approached with systematic thoroughness that characterized their operational doctrine, 2 soldiers from the local garrison conducting their scheduled inspection, whilst Van Alst maintained his routine of morning farm work. Inside the chamber, 47 men sat in complete silence, breathing shallowly, listening to German voices discussing the previous night's search results from neighboring properties. The inspection followed predictable patterns developed through 3 weeks of intensive sweep operations. Soldiers examined the farmhouse first, checking the cellar with infrared lamps designed to detect body heat through floors, questioning Van Alst about strangers, demanding to see identification papers and ration cards. The interrogation lasted 12 minutes, conducted with professional efficiency, but also with visible fatigue. These particular soldiers had been conducting searches for 20 consecutive days, processing dozens of farms daily, finding nothing except frightened Dutch civilians trying to survive occupation. Their operational assumption had solidified into certainty. Escaped British paratroopers had either been captured, killed, or had successfully evaded through German lines. Finding soldiers still hiding after 3 weeks seemed increasingly unlikely. When the Wehrmacht patrol approached the hayricks, their inspection was cursory. One soldier stabbed his bayonet into the base of the modified rick, probing approximately 1 meter deep, testing for hollow spaces. The blade entered hay that had been carefully repositioned to create solid resistance for the first 1.5 meters, specifically to defeat this exact inspection technique. The soldier felt appropriate resistance, withdrew the bayonet, and nodded to his companion. Their operational checklist showed agricultural storage inspected, and they moved to examine Van Alst's tool shed. Total time examining the hayrick, 45 seconds. Distance from nearest concealed paratrooper, 1.3 meters. Inside the chamber, Private Wright felt the bayonet probe pass close enough to hear the metal scraping through compressed hay. His breathing stopped completely until the German voices faded. Corporal Fletcher later recorded in the operational diary he maintained throughout the concealment, against regulations but for historical record, that at least 8 inspections followed this identical pattern during the first week. Wehrmacht efficiency created predictability that worked against German operational objectives. Once soldiers had categorized something as inspected, they conducted subsequent checks with decreasing thoroughness. The doctrinal conflict emerged from fundamentally different operational philosophies. German military procedure emphasized systematic thoroughness, checklist completion, and hierarchical reporting. Each property received classification codes. Fully inspected, partially inspected requires re-inspection. But the classification system created a psychological bias. Properties marked fully inspected multiple times without findings dropped in priority ranking. Soldiers conducting repetitive searches developed pattern fatigue, unconsciously assuming that locations searched thoroughly yesterday would yield identical results today. Wehrmacht operational efficiency, normally a tremendous advantage, became a vulnerability when facing opponents who understood how to exploit systematic predictability. British tactical doctrine, particularly within airborne and special operations units, specifically trained personnel to identify and exploit enemy procedural patterns. Davies had received instruction at Ringway that emphasized understanding German operational psychology. Wehrmacht soldiers followed procedures excellently, but that very excellence created blind spots. If you could position yourself where procedure said you couldn't possibly be, you became effectively invisible because German systematic thoroughness had already classified that location as cleared. The perplexity manifested in intercepted radio communications that Van Aalst overheard from German officers using his farmhouse as a temporary command post on 23 September. Wehrmacht intelligence was receiving conflicting reports. The mathematical accounting indicated that 40 to 50 British paratroopers remained unaccounted for in the sector. Systematic searches had eliminated virtually every traditional hiding location. Resistance networks reported no knowledge of British soldiers moving through underground routes. Yet intelligence reports from collaborators insisted that British personnel hadn't broken through German defensive lines. The operational conclusion being debated was whether the missing soldiers had been killed during the initial drop and bodies hadn't been recovered, or whether some unprecedented form of concealment was being employed that violated all tactical expectations. A Waffen-SS intelligence officer conducting his own investigation on 25 September questioned Van Aalst with considerably more aggression than regular Wehrmacht patrols. He specifically asked whether Van Aalst had noticed unusual disturbances in his hay storage, whether any bales appeared to have been moved recently, whether he'd observed signs of tampering. Van Aalst responded with perfect composure. The hay had been stacked in August, before German forces had established control of this sector. It hadn't been touched since, because he had no livestock remaining to feed. The SS officer examined the ricks personally, walking around each one, studying them from multiple angles, looking for visual irregularities. He spent 8 minutes examining the modified rick, far longer than any previous inspection. Inside, paratroopers could hear his boots walking around the perimeter, could hear him giving orders to soldiers to probe more deeply with bayonets. 3 blades penetrated the hay mass at different points. One came within 60 centimeters of the chamber wall. The SS officer's frustration was audible in his voice. He knew statistically that British soldiers had to be hiding somewhere in this sector, but every property showed no physical evidence of concealment. His operational problem was that Wehrmacht doctrine didn't account for soldiers deliberately hiding in locations that guaranteed discomfort, limited supplies, and tactical disadvantage. German military thinking assumed soldiers would seek optimized hiding positions with access to food, water, escape routes. A hayrick offered none of those advantages. The first direct engagement between German expectations and British improvisation occurred on 27th September when a Wehrmacht patrol brought a trained detection dog to Van Aalst's farm. The dog was specifically selected for tracking human scent, and its handler was experienced at detecting concealed personnel. The presence of the dog represented the most serious threat since the operation began. Dogs couldn't be fooled by visual camouflage and didn't follow systematic search patterns that could be predicted. Van Aalst responded with a tactic that revealed his own understanding of operational psychology. He immediately complained to the German patrol leader that his farm had been searched 15 times in 9 days, that he was cooperative with all German requirements, and that bringing dogs implied he was under suspicion despite full compliance. He demanded to know whether he should report this harassment to the local NSB liaison. His vocal protest created precisely the social dynamic that German soldiers wanted to avoid: conflict with ostensibly cooperative Dutch civilians that would generate administrative complications. The patrol leader, eager to avoid paperwork and complaints, conducted a perfunctory inspection with the dog, keeping the animal primarily around the farmhouse where human scent would naturally be concentrated. The dog never came within 20 meters of the hayrick. The patrol departed after 35 minutes. By the end of the second week, Wehrmacht search patterns had become entirely predictable. Inspections occurred twice daily, morning and evening, following routes that alternated but maintained consistent methodology. German operational reports, which Van Aalst occasionally overheard, indicated the systematic search was being scaled back because it was consuming excessive personnel resources while yielding diminishing returns. The working assumption among Wehrmacht officers was that missing British paratroopers had either died from wounds or had successfully infiltrated back through German lines using unknown routes. The possibility that they were concealed within 50 meters of soldiers conducting daily inspections was considered and dismissed as tactically implausible. Inside the chamber, living conditions had stabilized into sustainable routine despite appalling circumstances. The ventilation system proved adequate, barely. Carbon dioxide levels remained below dangerous thresholds, though men frequently complained of headaches and fatigue, indicating marginal oxygen supply. Temperature ranged from 5 degrees Celsius at night to 12 degrees during daytime, cold enough to require constant movement to prevent hypothermia, but not immediately life-threatening. Van Aalst provided food after dark by removing the concealed entrance panel: bread, potatoes, occasional preserved meat, water in containers. Quantities were minimal because excessive food delivery would arouse suspicion if German patrols observed Van Aalst's activities. The thematic revelation emerging from this operational paradox was profound. Wehrmacht Germany had constructed military efficiency to unprecedented levels, but that very systematization created exploitable weaknesses. British tactical flexibility, born from necessity and cultural emphasis on improvisation, allowed operations that violated German doctrinal assumptions. The hayrick concealment worked not despite being tactically disadvantageous, but because it was tactically disadvantageous. German military thinking couldn't accommodate soldiers deliberately accepting conditions that offered no optimized benefits. That blind spot proved more effective than any elaborate fortification could have been. The tactical situation changed dramatically on 4th of October, when Allied artillery fire became audible from the south, indicating that British XXX Corps had finally consolidated positions and was preparing renewed offensive operations. German defensive deployments shifted noticeably. Wehrmacht patrols at Van Aalst's farm decreased from twice daily to once daily, then to every second day as units were redeployed to defensive positions. The systematic search operation that had dominated the previous 3 weeks was effectively abandoned as German forces prioritized defending against conventional military threats rather than hunting isolated evaders. On 7th of October at 14:30, British reconnaissance units from the 43rd Wessex Division established contact with advanced positions 2 kilometres from Van Alst's farm. At 16 Nada, Sergeant Davies made the decision to emerge from concealment. 47 paratroopers, having spent 19 days buried beneath tons of hay, broke through the sealed entrance panel in daylight for the first time since 19th September. The physical condition of the men shocked the Wessex Division soldiers who first encountered them, gaunt from minimal rations, pale from absence of sunlight, several wounded men showing advanced infection, but alive and organized. Not a single soldier had been captured, not a single position had been compromised. The immediate aftermath was chaotic relief mixed with disbelief. Medical personnel from the Wessex Division established field treatment, administering antibiotics that had become available during the intervening weeks, treating infections, addressing malnutrition. Private Ashford's chest wound, which had threatened his life repeatedly during concealment, required surgical intervention. Corporal Fletcher's fractured leg had begun healing incorrectly and required re-breaking. Lance Corporal Hughes survived his infection through combination of constitution and the rudimentary medical treatment Davies had maintained throughout the concealment. The operational debriefing conducted by British intelligence officers on 8 October revealed details that fundamentally challenged existing evasion doctrine. The conventional wisdom, disperse, move constantly, avoid detection through mobility, had failed spectacularly during Market Garden. German search efficiency had captured or killed virtually every paratrooper who attempted traditional evasion tactics. The 47 men who survived did so specifically because they violated every standard procedure. They concentrated rather than dispersed. They remained static rather than mobile. They hid in a location that offered no tactical advantages, except being psychologically implausible to German operational thinking. The statistics quantified the operation's significance. Of approximately 350 British paratroopers who became separated from their units during Market Garden and attempted evasion in the Arnhem sector, fewer than 100 successfully returned to Allied lines. Of those 100, 47 came from Davies's single platoon, using Van Alst's Hay-Rick concealment. The survival rate for soldiers using conventional evasion tactics was approximately 15%. The survival rate for Davies's unit was 100%. The disparity was so extreme that initial intelligence officers suspected the debriefing accounts were exaggerated. Verification came through multiple sources. Hendrik van Alst provided testimony confirming the timeline, the construction methodology, and the German search patterns. Wehrmacht documents captured during subsequent operations included patrol reports specifically mentioning Van Alst's farm as thoroughly inspected, no findings, on 14 separate occasions between 19th September and 7th October. German intelligence assessments from the period explicitly noted that missing British personnel couldn't be located despite systematic searches eliminating all probable hiding locations. The broader implications resonated throughout British military planning. Special Operations executive analysts recognized that Davies's improvised concealment demonstrated principles applicable to resistance operations across occupied Europe. The concept of hiding in plain sight by deliberately choosing locations that were tactically disadvantageous but psychologically implausible became incorporated into training programs at Beaulieu, the SOE training facility. The specific ventilation engineering that Private Price had improvised was analyzed and refined into technical specifications for constructing concealed chambers in agricultural settings. The long-term consequences transformed operational doctrine beyond immediate military applications. Post-war analysis by military historians identified the Hay-Rick concealment as exemplifying broader strategic lessons about asymmetric warfare. Conventional military thinking optimizes for tactical advantage, positions offering protection, mobility, supply access, escape routes. But optimization creates predictability that systematic opponents can exploit. By deliberately accepting tactical disadvantage, Davies created unpredictability that defeated German systematic thoroughness. The personal legacies of the operation varied considerably among participants. Sergeant William Davies received the Distinguished Conduct Medal for leadership and tactical innovation, though the specific details of the Hayrick operation remained classified until 1987, when Cabinet Office documents were released under the 30-year rule. He returned to teaching mathematics in Stoke-on-Trent, never publicly discussing his wartime service. Former students later recalled him as a reserved man who emphasized the importance of solving problems by questioning assumptions. Private Edmund Price, the mining engineer whose ventilation design proved critical, received no formal military recognition because his contribution was classified. He returned to Durham coal fields, working as a safety engineer, designing mine ventilation systems. Colleagues noted that his ventilation calculations were unusually sophisticated, incorporating principles that seemed ahead of contemporary understanding. Price never explained that his expertise derived from engineering airflow for 47 men buried beneath agricultural storage whilst German patrols walked overhead. Hendrik van Aalst received recognition from the Dutch government after liberation, though he resisted public attention. When asked by Dutch resistance historians about his motivation for the extraordinary risk he'd accepted, his response was characteristically understated. German soldiers took my sons for labor. British soldiers were trying to liberate my country. The choice was obvious. He died in 1963, never having spoken publicly about the operation despite numerous requests from military historians. The 47 paratroopers maintained informal contact after demobilization, gathering annually on 19th of September at various locations in Britain. Attendance declined gradually as veterans aged and died. The final gathering occurred in 1994, the 50th anniversary, attended by 11 survivors. Sergeant Davies, speaking at that gathering, reflected that the operation had succeeded not through heroism or tactical brilliance, but through accepting what military doctrine said was impossible and improvising solutions because alternatives were unacceptable. The historiographical legacy emerged slowly as classified documents were released. Military historians initially dismissed accounts of the Hayrick concealment as embellished, questioning whether 47 men could survive 19 days in such conditions. Archival research during the 1990s verified every detail through cross-referencing British operational reports, German intelligence documents, and Dutch civilian testimony. The operation was reintegrated into Operation Market Garden historiography as a case study in tactical adaptation under impossible circumstances. The fundamental lesson the operation demonstrated resonated beyond military contexts. When systematic opponents employ overwhelming advantages, survival requires accepting conditions that seem untenable and improvising solutions that violate conventional optimization. The British paratroopers survived because they deliberately chose tactical disadvantage that was psychologically implausible to German military thinking. They endured cold, darkness, minimal food, psychological stress, and constant danger of suffocation because the alternative was certain capture. Their success vindicated the principle that human determination to survive, combined with creative improvisation, can defeat systematic efficiency when that efficiency becomes predictably routine. The Hayrick operation proved something fundamental about British national character during the Second World War: the capacity to maintain composure under conditions that seemed beyond endurance, the ability to improvise practical solutions when conventional methods failed, the determination to continue functioning when official doctrine said survival was impossible. These characteristics, manifested by ordinary soldiers who'd been teachers, miners, dock workers before conscription, demonstrated that warfare was ultimately decided not by equipment advantages or doctrinal sophistication, but by human will to survive and capacity to innovate when circumstances demanded it. If you found this remarkable story of British ingenuity and courage compelling, please subscribe to our channel for more untold accounts from the Second World War. We explore the moments when ordinary people achieved extraordinary things through determination and innovation. Share this story with anyone interested in history's most fascinating survival accounts. Comment below with your thoughts. Could you have endured 19 days beneath a haystack whilst enemy patrols searched overhead? Your engagement helps us continue bringing these incredible stories to light. Until next time, remember that history's greatest triumphs often came from those who refused to accept that survival was impossible.